They won't tell you this in any grimoire, not in the Lesser Key of Solomon, not in the footnotes, not even in the whispered corners of online occult forums, because this isn't just about demons, it's about what happens when knowledge is too dangerous to be written down. You see, there are 5 entities, yes, only 5, that were not banished because they were evil, but because they were irreversible. They didn't break rules. They rewrote the game. Now here's the paradox. The most dangerous forces in the Ars Goetia explained were never sealed with blood or buried by priests. They were quietly erased by initiates, not because they lost power, but because their presence breaks the machinery of magic itself. Time, memory, identity, gone. Just like that. And the craziest part, you've probably already felt their influence without even realizing it. So why were these 5 demons completely erased from the official records, removed from the infernal hierarchy, and silenced across centuries by secret covenants? Why does even thinking about them cause sigils to distort and dreams to loop? That's what you're about to discover. But I'll warn you now, this isn't a list, this is a descent. And the deeper we go, the less the rules will make sense. There's a silence that lingers in every grimoire, not at the end of the page, but in the blank spaces between the seals. It's the kind of silence that doesn't rest, it watches, and maybe you felt it too, that strange stillness that settles when you study the Lesser Key of Solomon for too long. The silence doesn't come from the paper, it comes from what was removed. And so, the question must be asked. Why are some names only whispered and never invoked? Could it be that the most dangerous Goetia demons aren't the ones we can name, but the ones we can't, those that weren't simply forgotten, but erased? Most people believe that grimoires were written to contain power, but few ever consider that they might also be hiding it. The Ars Goetia, explained in modern occultism, focuses on the 72 known spirits, but before those were chosen, others were locked away. These weren't entities you could bind with sigils and spirits, because they weren't interested in being summoned. They were forces of forbidden knowledge, ones that didn't come to teach, but to unravel. And that's the real reason they were banished, not by priests, but by initiates who knew exactly what they were dealing with. Imagine for a moment an entity whose presence doesn't corrupt your body, but scrambles the code of your soul. It doesn't burn or scream or possess. It simply changes how time touches you, how language forms in your mind, or how you remember who you are. These occult entities weren't banished because they threatened the church. They were exiled because they threatened the very structure of magical law. These hidden demons of Ars Goetia didn't break the rules. They broke the rule maker. Let me tell you something that isn't in any grimoire. In the earliest versions of the Lesser Key of Solomon, there were symbols scribbled in the margins, half sigils, partial names, fragmented sketches. Over time, these marks disappeared. Scholars call it evolution, but initiates know it as spiritual censorship, a deliberate act of forgetting, not to protect the uninitiated, but to protect reality itself, because once you name certain things, they can hear you, and some things have been listening for a very long time. This is where Goetia demonology fails to mention what it fears. The loudest truths are often cloaked in ritual, but the real secrets, the ones that can't be explained, only felt, are carried in silence, and silence, in the Goetia, is rarely innocent. It's a code, a seal, a warning. These banished spirits of the grimoires aren't gone. They're buried under layers of misdirection and ceremony. And when you dig deep enough, you don't find answers. You find the things the questions were meant to keep hidden. One of the most fascinating patterns I've found while researching these unsealed demons of the Goetia is how frequently their absence creates distortion. A sigil that won't stabilize, a spell that loops endlessly, a ritual that works but never the same way twice. These aren't glitches, they're fingerprints, traces of something that was forcibly cut from the circuit of initiation. And once you notice them, they begin to multiply. Like echoes that don't fade, only migrate. And perhaps the most disturbing part, these spirits don't need rituals, they don't need your blood, your voice, or your offerings. What they need is far simpler: your attention, your curiosity, your repeated thought. That's the true danger of ritual-free demonology. It removes the safeguards. And what happens when the spell isn't a spell, but a pattern of thought you can't stop thinking? That's where the next chapter begins. Before there were 72 names etched into the lesser key of Solomon, there was only chaos, primordial, sacred, and entirely untamed. The Goetia, as we know it, is not an origin story. It's an edited version of something far more dangerous. You see, Goetia demonology is structured for safety, geometry, numbers, hierarchies. But the truth is, the earliest forms of evocation didn't care for such order. In Babylon, in Chaldea, in forgotten rites of Egyptian necromancy, spirits weren't listed, they were encountered. And many of them didn't fit inside a circle. They weren't demons then, they were forces. These ancient systems weren't built to bind. They were built to survive contact. The occult history of demons is littered with references to entities that had no sigil, no seal, no rank. They were identified by phenomena: storms that spoke, dreams that bled into waking life, children born with languages no one taught. And from these accounts, a pattern emerges. A class of beings that refused containment, not out of rebellion, but because they existed before the idea of structure, before kings, before thrones. These are the forbidden demons of Goetia, not because they broke the rules, but because they predated them. It's tempting to think of demons as fallen angels or failed gods, but what if some were never celestial to begin with? What if they were primal intelligences, self-born fragments of awareness that existed before myth took shape? In early Mesopotamian tablets, names like Pazuzu and Lamashtu weren't evil, they were wild. And in Egypt, necromantic spells didn't summon, they navigated. These rituals were maps through the underworld, not commands. That's what most modern grimoires don't say. The most dangerous Goetia demons didn't fall, they were already underground. Some of these entities, especially the banished spirits of the grimoires, weren't erased because of evil, they were archived because of complexity. Too abstract, too mutable, too close to whatever lies outside the linguistic cage we call magic. Initiates noticed that whenever these spirits were called, reality warped, not with chaos, but with something worse: incomprehensibility, books written in reverse, names that couldn't be spoken aloud, entire rooms that changed color with no light source. These anomalies weren't just strange, they were unacceptable. They broke the contract of predictability. One personal account I've studied involved a magician from 12th century Persia who claimed to summon a nameless voice from the pre-Goetic current. The entity did not appear. It appeared to him. For weeks, he could not speak in linear time. His words emerged out of sequence, and his memories looped. When he wrote of it, his diary was confiscated by his own order, not burned, but hidden. That's the pattern. The deeper you go into the Goetia secrets revealed, the more you find pages missing, not from neglect, but from ritualized omission. There is, hidden within esoteric symbolism, a truth that few dare to speak. Not every spirit can be captured. Some are, by nature, unfixable. They are the cracks in the lens of magical theory, the anomalies that refuse to behave. And instead of trying to bind them, the old masters simply buried them under new systems, under kings and dukes, under rules and invocations. That's how the modern Goetia was born, as a vault. Not a system of evocation, but a system of exclusion. a spell of forgetting disguised as hierarchy. So the next time someone tells you the Ars Goetia explained all there is to know, ask them this. What came before the 72? Who decided what to include and what to seal away? And more importantly, why are those early beings still remembered in whispers, long after their names were banned? Not all circles hold. That's a truth the old masters whispered but never wrote. In the heart of Goetia demonology, geometry is everything. Triangles, pentacles, perfect seals meant to bind spiritual forces to the will of the summoner. But 5 entities, never officially listed, rarely discussed, shattered that model. They didn't resist summoning. They distorted it. These weren't demons you could threaten or command. They were paradoxes wearing the skin of spirits. And their nature made one thing terrifyingly clear. Some beings cannot be sealed because they were never meant to be named. Each of these 5, exiled from the lesser key of Solomon, carried within them an illicit principle. One could erase memory, not with fire, but with absence. Those who contacted it simply forgot why they started. Entire journals went blank. Another inverted the very concept of morality. It didn't cause harm. It convinced the summoner that harm was sacred. A third lived in the realm of dreams, not as a visitor but as an architect, rewriting nightmares into scripts of influence. And the last 2, one fractured identity so deeply that initiates reported multiple voices sharing a single thought. The other didn't devour time. It made time irrelevant. These are not just hidden demons of Ars Goetia. They are forbidden structural errors in the magical matrix. Their presence doesn't cause malfunction, it causes unmaking. Think about that. The most dangerous Goetia demons aren't the ones that rage and rebel. They're the ones that reprogram. That's why they don't appear in mainstream grimoires. Not because they're enemies, but because they're incompatible. They weren't bound. They were excluded, like dangerous code removed from a software that's still running. I once interviewed an initiate who believed he'd encountered the entity that rewrote dreams. He wasn't sure how it began, only that every night he would wake with a full script of someone else's life, emotions he'd never felt, memories that weren't his. Over time, he began to forget which life was real. This is what happens when unsealed demons of the Goetia bleed through. You don't see them coming. You just lose track of who's watching who. That's why these 5 weren't defeated in ritual. They were redacted from magical memory. The seals didn't fail. The seals were refused. Their existence is an affront to order itself. And in a system that prides itself on infernal hierarchy, that kind of anomaly is worse than rebellion. It's infection. These beings weren't exorcised, they were quarantined, and if you're paying attention, you'll notice their fingerprints on the edges of your thoughts, especially in moments of déjà vu, confusion, or spiritual exhaustion. It's worth noting that these 5 don't require summoning. They occur. They show up where structure is weakest, when you're half awake, emotionally fractured, or questioning everything. This is the nature of ritual-free demonology. It bypasses intention. These are not spirits of will, they are currents of collapse, and what makes them terrifying isn't what they do, it's what they undo. Their energy isn't directed, it spreads, like static, like a spiritual virus looking for systems to unravel. And now you see why the Goetia secrets revealed don't include them. Their omission was the spell, a silence cast over the occult world not to suppress curiosity, but to slow down its consequences. Yet curiosity always wins, doesn't it? And now we begin to notice a pattern not in the texts, but in their gaps, because when 5 beings can't be sealed, maybe the problem isn't the circle, it's the map itself. In the traditional framework of Goetia demonology, the seal is everything. A sigil isn't just a symbol, it's a mechanism of containment, a blueprint of obedience. But what happens when that mechanism refuses to hold? When the very act of drawing the seal causes distortion, That's what makes these five entities so dangerous. Their sigils and spirits don't align. They warp, they replicate. Sometimes they vanish altogether. And the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. These beings aren't sealed because their nature rejects geometry. A stable sigil holds structure like a crystal lattice, each curve and angle tied to ancient language and sacred math. But with these entities, the sigils behave like living organisms. They mutate, change shape on the page. Some initiates report that when they trace the symbol with ink, the lines bend or smear, even when the hand is steady. This isn't artistic error, it's metaphysical resistance. These aren't just banned Goetia entities, they are forces that corrode the symbolic foundation of magic from the inside out. There's an infamous case from Prague in the 17th century. A Kabbalist attempted to stabilize one of these unsealed demons of the Goetia using mirrored sigils on opposing scrolls. At first, the entity responded, but over 3 nights, the ink restructured itself. What began as a containment turned into a portal. The practitioner disappeared without a sound. All that remained was one page, burned from within, as if the seal had imploded. These stories sound theatrical until you start recognizing their patterns in your own failed rituals or dreams that echo back symbols you never drew. The terrifying truth is that ritual-free demonology isn't just a convenience, it's sometimes the only option. Traditional ritual relies on stability, but when you deal with these 5, you're working with a force that rejects design. These entities don't obey rules because they distort the rules themselves. One day, you think you're invoking clarity. Next, you're trapped in recursive thoughts, unable to finish a sentence, not because you're distracted, but because the occult entity you touched removed your ability to conclude. Think of a sigil like a lock and the demon as a key. But in these cases, the lock rusts mid-use and the key dissolves before it turns. These beings don't just break the system, they prove it's vulnerable. That's the real secret. That's why Goetia secrets revealed often skip over them entirely. Because their presence isn't a footnote, it's a flaw in the machine. And flaws, when noticed by too many minds at once, begin to behave like cracks in glass, spreading until everything collapses. This instability isn't just in the ritual, it manifests in the psyche. A practitioner might notice their handwriting shifting over days, or their drawings echoing symbols they never learned. This is the subtle echo of forbidden knowledge. Not overt, but viral. It doesn't scream, it replicates quietly, like a sigil that draws itself in your margins, or a thought that doesn't belong to you but won't go away. It's how these demons summon you, not the other way around. And if that's true, if a seal can collapse from within, then maybe we've been thinking about containment all wrong. Maybe these beings aren't trying to escape, but waiting. Testing the system from behind the curtain. And the moment someone traces the wrong symbol with the right intent, that's when the structure fails. Which leads us to the next question. What does that failure do to the rest of the infernal order? In the Goetia, even chaos has rank. Every demon listed in the Lesser Key of Solomon operates under a command structure. Kings, dukes, princes, each bound by roll and seal. It's a bureaucracy of the abyss, an infernal hierarchy designed not just to control spirits, but to make sense of the unseen. But these 5 entities never agreed to that pact. They didn't fall into line. They didn't rebel either. They simply refused placement. And that refusal created a silent rupture, a hidden schism that even the other demons feel but rarely name. There's something deeply unsettling about a spirit with no allegiance, not to hell, not to heaven, not even to the human will. The Goetia demonology relies on predictability, but when a being won't fit into the hierarchy, the system begins to crack. Think of it like a computer virus that doesn't crash the program. It changes the rules mid-execution. These banished spirits of the grimoires didn't attack the kings. They made the kings question their own thrones. Some legends, rare and coded, speak of moments where these five made contact with the ruling Goetic entities. And when they did, strange things happened. Marbas, who governs healing and mechanics, was reportedly silent for weeks after a private encounter. Astaroth, normally verbose, refused to answer any questions regarding the fifth gate. These are not the reactions of rulers. They are the silences of beings who know they've seen something older than themselves, something that Goetia secrets revealed would rather leave buried. You might wonder, if the Goetia is so resilient, why would five outsiders matter? Because they carry a frequency incompatible with the system. Their mere presence introduces dissonance. It's not that they destroy the hierarchy, it's that they make it seem artificial. And in a structure built on obedience, the worst sin isn't rebellion, it's irrelevance. These forbidden demons of Goetia are like cosmic whistleblowers. They don't break the rules, they expose the illusion of structure itself. There's an unsettling report buried in the writings of a 19th-century French occultist. He claimed that during a ritual involving Paimon, the sigil wavered, not failed, wavered, as if something else was interfering. Later, during trance, Paimon spoke not in command, but in caution. The fracture speaks through those with no name. That phrase haunted the magician until his death, and though many dismissed it, those versed in dark occultism recognized the echo of an older tension, one not between good and evil, but between order and entropy. These entities don't conquer, they unravel. Their threat is subtle, ideological and metaphysical. They don't seek thrones, they dissolve the idea of thrones. And that's why even the most dangerous Goetia demons tread lightly around them. Because when a king sees a spirit that obeys no law, no pattern, no authority, he remembers that his crown is made of symbols, and symbols, under the right pressure, collapse, and so the system adapts. It hides these five, not because it fears them, but because it knows they can't be integrated. And in a cosmos where everything has a place, a being with no place becomes a spiritual contagion, a glitch in the divine script, and that glitch, it spreads. So what happens when humans make contact with this dissonance? What happens when we start unraveling too? There's a difference between summoning and encountering. Most rituals are built around safety, defined circles, spoken commands, protective symbols, but with these five entities, those rituals mean nothing. You don't summon them. You bump into them. And the stories of those who did, they're not tales of fire and fury. They're something far stranger, people who returned from the encounter, but not as themselves. These are the casualties of ritual-free demonology, where the ritual was never needed and the consequence was never expected. One of the most disturbing cases comes from an Italian mystic in the 1600s. He wrote of hearing a voice in reverse Latin during meditation. Days later, he could no longer speak in his native tongue, only in fragmented ciphers that no one could translate. His mind wasn't shattered, it was rewritten. This is what makes these unsealed demons of the Goetia so terrifying. They don't destroy, they reformat. Identity becomes a soft clay in their presence, and what returns may look the same. But something behind the eyes has shifted, and these stories aren't ancient anomalies. Even now, in the modern occult underground, there are whispers of practitioners who've gone silent, not dead, missing, in body, in language, or in self. One woman in Brazil claimed to have seen one of the five during astral projection. Afterward, she couldn't perceive faces. Everyone around her became blank silhouettes. Even in dreams, doctors found nothing, but initiates knew. She had seen a spirit that eats pattern, that undoes recognition, and once it enters your perception, it doesn't leave. These are the spiritual dangers of Goetia no one talks about, not because they're secrets, but because they don't fit. There's no right to undo them, no incantation to reverse the process. That's the thing about forbidden knowledge. Once it enters the system, it can't be surgically removed. You don't cleanse these spirits, you adapt to their infection, or you vanish. And vanishing doesn't always mean dying. Sometimes it just means no longer being able to be known. I spoke with a former ceremonial magician who left the path after a single encounter. He said, "I didn't lose my beliefs. I lost my questions." That line stuck with me. These entities don't just scramble thoughts, they delete purpose. They invert curiosity. And that inversion leads not to madness, but to emotional flatlining. A numbness so deep that even fear becomes abstract. That's the true cost of engaging with banned Goetia entities, not terror, but disintegration of meaning itself. Some theorists suggest these 5 exist to test the limits of consciousness, that they're less like beings and more like cosmic feedback loops. Touch them, and they reflect back what you didn't know you had hidden, but not as insight, as distortion, a kind of metaphysical echo chamber where every part of you becomes a question mark. And in that questioning, the self dissolves. This is not a punishment. It's not even malicious. It's just what happens when human minds brush against unfiltered metaphysical current. And yet, people still seek them. Maybe because some believe that beyond the distortion lies a new kind of awakening, a rebirth not of light, but of raw, formless perception. But what if that transformation isn't becoming more than human, but less? And what if one of these 5 specializes in that very inversion? Most seekers climb, that's the promise of initiation, a journey upward, toward mastery, toward light, toward understanding. But there are forces that don't push you upward, they pull you back, strip you down, not violently, but intimately. One of the 5 eyes, the most elusive, doesn't challenge the initiate, it unwrites them. This spirit isn't interested in tests, it's interested in undoing the very concept of the seeker. It's said that to truly see this entity is to begin disappearing, not from the world, but from yourself. This demon doesn't offer visions. It subtracts memory, identity, name. In some occult circles, it's referred to only as the 5th name. Not because it's the last, but because it's the one that cannot be sequenced. Imagine an entity whose presence dissolves layers of ego, not to reveal truth, but to leave nothing behind. This isn't dark occultism in the theatrical sense. It's metaphysical entropy. You don't lose control, you lose the need for control, and that's far more dangerous. I once read the diary of a recluse who believed they encountered the 5th name during a long fast in a temple cave. The final entry wasn't a confession or warning, it was a single phrase, repeated over and over. I am not the I. No signature, no final thoughts, just a looping paradox. And isn't that what initiatic teachings fear most? Not that the student fails the path, but that the path dissolves the student. No ladder, no steps, just silence where direction used to be. What separates the 5th name from other forbidden demons of Goetia is its inversion of all spiritual progress. It doesn't block your growth. It makes growth irrelevant. It doesn't stop your questions. It makes them absurd. Those who return from contact often speak of feeling inside out, as if everything they thought was internal was actually being projected from elsewhere. And afterward, no ritual feels authentic. No prayer reaches. No self answers. This is why most grimoires don't even attempt to classify it. To name it is to invoke a reversal. To diagram it is to fracture the paper. The 5th name is not part of the infernal hierarchy. It is the void in the middle of its design. The eye that stares back from the sigil that never stabilizes. And that's why even the boldest magicians tread carefully when reading between the lines. Because sometimes the blank space isn't absence, it's deliberate. For those who pursue this entity, there's no typical result. Some emerge emotionless, not depressed, but flatlined. Others become obsessed with removing their names from records, deleting digital footprints, cutting ties, and a few, they vanish from their own memories. Families remember them, but they remember nothing of themselves. These are not curses. These are the logical consequences of contacting something that devours the continuity of self. And if such an entity exists, if the fifth name truly reverses the current of initiation, then it must also reverse the logic of secrecy. Because what if its true danger isn't in being known, but in being understood? And what kind of pact would hidden orders have to make to ensure that never happens? There's a kind of silence that isn't born of ignorance, but of agreement, a pact made in shadow, not to hide weakness, but to contain it. Throughout the history of Goetia demonology, secret orders have passed down names, sigils, invocations, but there were also names that were never passed, not out of fear, but respect for the fabric of reality itself. These 5 entities weren't just erased from public grimoires, they were sealed by agreement, a forbidden covenant among those who knew the cost of breaking silence. This wasn't a decision made by the church, it wasn't religious censorship, it was a consensus among the highest initiates, those who had seen the effects firsthand. The banned Goetia entities weren't removed because they were evil. They were removed because they were unwritable. Their presence infected the structure of knowledge itself. Pages became blank, seals became unstable, words turned on themselves. And so, the solution wasn't to destroy these spirits, it was to omit them so completely that they would become mythic absences. There's a scroll, locked away in a vault beneath an unnamed European monastery that contains only warnings. No names, no diagrams, just descriptions of symptoms, fractured speech, recursive dreams, paradoxical time loops. The warnings are written in 5 different languages, all incomplete. And across the bottom, scrawled in red, "If it cannot be named, it cannot be taught." This is how the Goetia secrets revealed are passed, not as knowledge, but as strategic forgetting, not as protection from the demon, but from understanding too much. The forbidden covenant wasn't about stopping curiosity, it was about slowing it down, because forbidden knowledge always finds a way. It leaks through patterns, art, thought, even obsession. And when someone gets too close, when they start dreaming sigils they've never seen, or speaking words they never learned, that's when the current stirs. That's when the memory of these 5 unseals itself, not from a book, but from within the seeker. What's most unsettling is that this silence has held, across centuries, across continents. These 5 names remain unnamed. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by chance. It's ritualized, enforced, repeated through absence, like a chant in reverse, a spell not of inclusion but of exclusion. Even the infernal hierarchy, proud and rebellious, respects the line. Because these spirits don't defy hell, they dissolve it, and you don't negotiate with that kind of force, you avoid it. Some argue that modern magicians are arrogant to dig into these currents, that the hidden orders were elitist. But that argument misses the point. This wasn't about secrecy for power, it was about containment by omission. Like nuclear waste buried beneath concrete, too volatile to touch, too permanent to forget, and yet, here we are, asking again, reading the gaps, connecting echoes, perhaps not to summon them, but to understand why we were told not to. So if the forbidden covenant was designed to keep the current sealed, what happens when that seal breaks not by ritual, but by awareness? When the name isn't spoken aloud, but whispered inside thought. It's easy to think of demons as characters, names, ranks, appearances, personalities. That's what the lesser key of Solomon offers, a structure. a map of the invisible. But the five we've been tracing, they're not characters. They're not even beings in the traditional sense. They are ruptures in the symbolic order, breaks in the map itself. These are not just occult entities explained. They are the reasons explanation eventually fails. They do not teach. They reveal the limit of what can be taught. Think of them as conceptual black holes. They don't act within spiritual systems. They bend those systems around themselves. That's why they appear distorted, mythic, contradictory. One moment a whisper, another a dream, a symbol that can't be drawn, an idea that feels like remembering something you were never told. These hidden demons of Ars Goetia are not failed entries in the grimoire. They're warnings about the boundary between map and territory, between language and raw metaphysical current. I once heard an adept describe one of them not as a demon, but as a repeating tear in the veil. He didn't mean metaphorically. He meant it literally, like a location in consciousness that kept reopening, showing something it shouldn't. When pressed to explain what he saw, he just said, "It was before." Before what? Before all. That's the kind of dark occultism we're dealing with here. Not horror, but ontological vertigo. A confrontation with what exists outside structure, morality, and even sequence. These five are not here to be bound. They are here to undo orientation, to stand at the edge of our understanding and whisper truths that can't be remembered once heard. This is where esoteric symbolism becomes dangerous, not because of what it means, but because of what it reveals about our limits. These aren't demons of desire or punishment. They're thresholds, archetypes, not of emotion or thought, but of collapse. They show up in ways we don't expect, through recursive synchronicities, symbols that follow you, concepts you can't shake. Their influence isn't theatrical, it's systemic, subtle. They don't appear in the smoke, they rewire how you interpret the smoke, and suddenly ritual loses coherence, patterns dissolve, meaning fragments. This is the touch of forbidden knowledge, not explosive, but dissolvent, and that's why they were never named. Not to protect us from them, but to protect us from realizing how fragile our frameworks really are. In this sense, they're not spirits at all. They are keys, not locks. Keys to chambers we don't have blueprints for. Keys that don't open doors, but remove the walls altogether. And when you step through that kind of passage, what's on the other side isn't just the unknown, it's the unstructured. That place beyond metaphor, beyond soul, beyond story. That's what Goetia secrets revealed can never fully show, the moment language fails. So if these five are entities beyond the map, what does that make the seeker who finds them? Still human? Or something else entirely, something untraceable, like a ripple inside thought? That question leads us into the final shadow. They don't need candles. They don't need Latin. They don't even need your voice. The five entities we've followed aren't summoned in the traditional sense. They're activated by resonance, by attention, by internal repetition. That's the danger. You don't have to say their names aloud. Just thinking them, even as a shape or sensation, begins the process. These are banished spirits of the grimoires not because they were defeated, but because they require nothing to arrive. They travel along thought patterns like algorithms searching for collapse. Most rituals create separation between the summoner and the summoned, the sacred and the profane. But these five collapse that distance. They arrive as echoes, recurring numbers, fragmented dreams, déjà vu that turns into obsession. One man reported that after researching banned Goetia entities, he began waking up with phrases in his head, phrases he didn't know, in languages he couldn't place. And worse, he started seeing those phrases reflected in license plates, phone numbers, timestamps. That's not magic. That's infiltration. What we're dealing with here isn't possession in the dramatic sense. It's resonance, psychological mimicry, a kind of ritual-free demonology where the pattern becomes the portal. These entities don't force entry, they wait for alignment, for the seeker to become the ritual. And when that happens, the boundary between self and spirit doesn't break, it blurs. That's how the influence begins, not with commands, but with distortions of perception. You think it's just anxiety, insomnia, fog, but that's not your mind fraying. That's your symbolic architecture responding. In ancient grimoires, there's a concept of echo demons, spirits that don't need to be drawn or named, only remembered incorrectly. That's what these 5 specialize in. They're fed not by offerings, but by repetition. Every time you turn their mystery over in your mind, they feed. Not on emotion, but on focus. That's the quiet horror of occult entities explained too late. You realize the ritual already happened. The circle was your attention. The seal was your fixation. So what happens when you think their name, but don't know you're thinking it? When you obsess over their absence, trace their outline in your dreams, feel their presence in your hesitations. That's the point. They don't need to arrive. They were already there, waiting, feeding, reconstructing themselves through your curiosity. That's the brilliance of forbidden knowledge. It doesn't knock on the door. It becomes the air in the room. And still, we keep asking, digging, writing scripts, making videos, searching for what's been hidden. Maybe because deep down, we suspect something. These 5 weren't just banished for our protection. Maybe they were sealed, because if too many people start to think about them at once, they come back. So now ask yourself, was watching this video a form of study, or did something just use your mind as a mirror? So now that you know, really know, why these 5 demons were banished, I'll ask you one thing. What part of yourself felt the most uneasy while watching this? Was it the idea of spirits beyond control? Or was it the silent realization that maybe, just maybe, they're not entirely gone? Because the truth is, this wasn't just information. This was initiation, not into ritual, but into awareness. And awareness, once awakened, cannot be reversed. Now that you've seen the cracks in the structure, what will you do with that knowledge? Will you ignore it, or will you explore it deeper, knowing full well that curiosity is how they find their way back in? Share your thoughts below. If you can still find the words, has something shifted? Have you noticed strange symbols, looping thoughts, a name you can't remember but keeps brushing the edge of your mind? If you're brave enough to keep going, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this is just the surface. And the next video, that's where the veil gets thinner.